He had it all: money, power, and a promising future. But on the most important day, he made the worst choice of his life. Now, years later, fate brings his greatest loss before him. Is it too late to reclaim what money could never buy? The Pundin. Ballroom of the Plaza Hotel sparkled under the light of thousands of crystals hanging from elaborate golden chandeliers. New York City's elite gathered for another charity event, and between glasses of champagne and superficial conversations, Richard Morgan observed his reflection in one of the huge mirrors decorating the walls. At 35, he was the embodiment of success: impeccably styled hair, tailored Italian suit, and a business empire that placed his name among the most influential in the country. As he adjusted his silk tie in an automatic gesture, his dark brown eyes caught a familiar movement at the other end of the ballroom. For a moment, his heart stopped. There, less than 20 meters away, was Hannah Carter. 10 years had passed since the last time he saw her, since that day that would forever change the course of their lives. Hannah was different. Her black hair, once long and wavy, now framed her face in a modern shoulder-length cut. She wore a red dress that accentuated her elegant silhouette, and her posture emanated a confidence that Richard didn't recognize. At her side, a tall man with graying hair smiled as she animatedly gestured during a conversation with a small group of people. Richard felt his fingers involuntarily tighten around his champagne flute. A wave of memories washed over him, transporting him back to that spring morning when he had made the biggest mistake of his life. "Morgan!" The deep voice of Charles Edwards, one of his most important shareholders, yanked him from his thoughts. "Good to find you here. We need to discuss that proposal for the merger with the Asian group." Richard tried to maintain his composure, but his eyes remained fixed on Hannah. She still hadn't noticed his presence, and he wondered if he should approach her, if after so much time he would have the courage to face her. "Morgan, are you listening to me?" Charles insisted, following Richard's gaze. "Ah, I see you've already noticed our newest competitor, Hannah Carter. Impressive what she managed to do with that startup in just 5 years. They say she's going to expand into the European market next quarter." The words hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. Hannah was no longer that dreamy young woman he had met in business school. Now she was a successful entrepreneur, occupying the same space as him in the competitive business world. "Do you know each other?" Charles asked, noticing Richard's troubled expression. Before he could answer, the chatter in the ballroom diminished, and the master of ceremonies announced the start of dinner. The guests began to move to their assigned tables, and Richard felt a chill down his spine as he consulted his place card. Table 18. His eyes scanned the room until he found the golden number on the white linen tablecloth, and then he saw Hannah was seated directly across from him. Fate, which had kept them apart for 10 years, now placed them face to face. Richard felt the weight of each step as he approached the table, aware that in the next few minutes he would have to face not only Hannah, but also all the ghosts he had carried since that fateful day. During his journey to his seat, fragments of memories assaulted him. Her smile the first time they met on the university campus, the afternoon studying together in the library, their first kiss, exchanged in the rain after an economics class, the sparkle in her eyes when he proposed to her, in a simple restaurant in the neighborhood where they grew up. And then, the moment that had haunted him for a decade, him standing before the altar, while hundreds of expectant gazes awaited his response. As he approached the table, Richard realized that the man accompanying Hannah, introduced as Gabriel Torres, her business partner, was observing him with an expression that mixed curiosity and mistrust. Hannah, for her part, kept her eyes fixed on the menu in front of her, as if studying each word with extreme concentration. "Good evening, everyone," Richard managed to say, his voice hoarser than he would have liked. The other occupants of the table responded with polite smiles and nods. Hannah, however, remained motionless for a few seconds before raising her gaze. When their eyes finally met, Richard felt the impact of 10 years of regret concentrated in a single moment. There was no anger or hurt in her look, only a studied indifference that hurt more than any display of resentment could. "Good evening, Mr. Morgan," she said, with a formality that was like an ice wall between them. Her voice, though soft, carried a firmness he had never known. This was no longer the Hannah he had left at the altar. She was a woman who had rebuilt herself from the ashes of public humiliation. The dinner proceeded in an atmosphere of veiled tension. While the other guests discussed trivialities and business, Richard observed Hannah's every move, trying to reconcile the image of the confident woman before him with the memories of the young woman he had once promised to love forever. She conducted conversations with natural elegance, discussing market trends and business strategies with the same ease with which she talked about art and literature. Her partner, Gabriel, clearly admired her, completing her sentences and exchanging knowing looks that made Richard's stomach churn. At one point, when dessert was being served, Hannah mentioned her most recent achievement. Her company had been selected for an acceleration program in Silicon Valley. The other diners congratulated her effusively, while Richard remained silent, struggling against the realization that she had achieved on her own everything he once feared he couldn't provide for her. "Success is sweeter when built with your own hands," Hannah commented, and although she was responding to a compliment from someone else at the table, her eyes met Richard's for a brief instant. At that moment, he understood that each of her achievements was also proof of his cowardice, of how he had underestimated not only her love, but her strength and determination. The dinner came to an end, and the guests began to disperse around the ballroom again. Richard watched Hannah rise gracefully, accept the arm offered by Gabriel, and walk towards the bar. His entire body screamed to follow her, to try and approach, but something kept him glued to his chair, perhaps the same fear that had made him run away 10 years ago. When he finally found the strength to stand up, Richard realized that his life of success and luxury, which he had worked so hard to build, seemed empty and meaningless. The empire he had erected, the professional achievements, the respect in the business world, none of it filled the void left by that spring morning when he chose others' expectations over his own heart. The night wore on, and while guests danced and conversed to the sound of a string orchestra, Richard remained on the sidelines, his eyes inevitably seeking Hannah among the crowd. Each of her smiles, each elegant gesture was like a needle in his heart, reminding him of everything he had lost out of fear of disappointing his family and friends. The first chapter of this story ended as it had begun, with Richard Morgan observing his reflection, but this time he saw not only the successful businessman that everyone admired, he also saw the man who, out of fear of risking everything, had ended up losing what really mattered. The morning after the charity event, Richard couldn't concentrate on his usual routine. Sitting in his office on the 40th floor of one of New York City's most prestigious buildings, he gazed at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but his mind was stuck on the images from the previous night. The open laptop in front of him displayed a series of news articles about HC Tech, Hannah's company. The headlines were impressive. American startup revolutionizes sustainable technology market. HC Tech closes multi-million-dollar partnership with European giant. Hannah Carter, the visionary changing the national technology landscape. Mr. Morgan? His assistant's voice over the intercom brought him back to reality. The board is waiting for the 10 o'clock meeting. Richard adjusted his tie, an automatic gesture he had used for years to compose his professional demeanor. But today was different. The mask of the successful and unshakable executive was cracking, and through the fissures escaped all the emotions he had tried to suppress for a decade. In the boardroom, while his directors discussed projections and strategies, Richard found himself absent-mindedly drawing circles on his notepad. His mind wandered to a simpler time, when he and Hannah were planning their future together in the small apartment they shared during college. What about HC Tech's proposal? The mention of Hannah's company name yanked him from his reverie. It was Charles Edwards again, now with a folder of documents open in front of him. They're developing technology that could revolutionize our renewable energy sector. It would be a strategic partnership. Richard felt his stomach churn. What? A proposal? The one that came in last week. Didn't you receive the report I sent? Charles frowned. Hannah Carter personally presented the project, It's exactly what we need for international expansion. The universe seemed to be playing an elaborate prank on Richard. Not only had they reconnected at last night's event, but now their professional paths were also about to cross. He quickly flipped through the folder Charles handed him, trying to maintain his composure as he read the project details. "We need to schedule a meeting with their team as soon as possible," Charles insisted. "Other companies have already shown interest and we can't lose this opportunity." Richard nodded mechanically, but inside his world was in turmoil. The idea of having to work closely with Hannah, of having to maintain a strictly professional relationship, while every fiber of his being screamed to try to fix the mistakes of the past, seemed like an exquisite form of torture. After the meeting, he retreated to his office again. On impulse, he opened his personal laptop and accessed a folder he hadn't touched in years. There were all their photos together. Trips, dinners with friends, everyday moments that at the time seemed ordinary, but now carried the weight of lost happiness. One photo in particular caught his attention. It was from the day they bought their first car together, a used and modest model that barely fit the month's groceries. Hannah smiled radiantly next to the vehicle, its keys jingling proudly in her hands. "Our first joint asset," she had said, laughing. At the time, Richard secretly felt ashamed that he couldn't offer something better, pressured by the expectations of his traditionally wealthy family. The sound of a notification on his cell phone brought him back to the present. It was a message from his mother, Elizabeth Morgan. "Son, I saw the photos from yesterday's event. Wasn't that Hannah Carter? We need to talk." Richard sighed deeply. His mother had been one of the main voices against his relationship with Hannah, always insisting that he deserved someone of the same social level. The irony didn't escape him. Now Hannah was as successful as he was, if not more so. Determined not to repeat the mistakes of the past, he ignored his mother's message and opened his browser. He typed Hannah's name and began to read every interview, every article he could find. In one from 3 years ago, she talked about her journey. "I learned that sometimes we need to lose everything to discover what we're really capable of. Each obstacle became a stepping stone for my growth. Today I don't regret anything. Every disappointment made me stronger." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. She had transformed the humiliation he had caused her into fuel for her success. Meanwhile, he had hidden behind his business empire, accumulating empty achievements and superficial relationships. His secretary interrupted his thoughts again. "Mr. Morgan, the PR team is requesting your presence for the official photo of the new institutional campaign." Richard stood up, adjusted his suit, and walked to the makeshift studio on the floor below. As the photographer adjusted the lights, he thought about how his public image had become his prison. Every photo, every interview, every social appearance was carefully choreographed to maintain the facade of the successful and unshakable businessman. "More to the right, Mr. Morgan. That's it," chin slightly raised. "Show confidence." The photographer's instructions sounded ironic. Confidence was exactly what he hadn't felt since seeing Hannah again. At the end of the photo session back in his office, Richard made a decision. He couldn't let history repeat itself. The partnership proposal with HC Tech was more than a business opportunity. It was a chance for redemption, or at least to show Hannah that he was no longer that cowardly young man who had abandoned her. With trembling fingers, he picked up the phone and dialed his assistant. "Angela, please schedule a meeting with the HC Tech team as soon as possible, and prepare a complete dossier on the company and its main projects." As the sun set over the city, painting the sky in shades of orange, Richard remained in his office studying every detail of Hannah's projects. Each page he read revealed more about the extraordinary woman she had become and deepened his regret even further. On his desk, the photo from his company's last annual report stared at him, he in the center, surrounded by his directors, all in rehearsed poses and professional smiles. For the first time, he saw the image for what it really was, a portrait of loneliness disguised as success. The phone rang again. It was Angela. "Mr. Morgan, I managed to schedule the meeting with HC Tech for tomorrow at 2 p.m. Ms. Carter confirmed her personal attendance. Richard felt his heart race. In less than 24 hours, he would be face to face with Hannah again, this time on his turf. The night would be long, and he knew he wouldn't be able to sleep. He had less than a day to prepare not just for a business meeting, but to face the ghosts that had haunted him for 10 years. The clock struck 1:45 p.m. when Hannah Carter strode through the luxurious lobby of Morgan Enterprises. Dressed in an elegant navy blue suit and high heels, she carried herself with a presence that made people turn their heads in her direction. Gabriel Torres, her partner and confidant, walked beside her, carrying a folder with the presentation documents. "Are you sure you want to conduct this meeting personally?" Gabriel asked as they waited for the elevator. "I can easily handle this alone." Hannah discreetly adjusted the pearl necklace that had belonged to her grandmother, one of the few mementos she kept from her family. "I didn't come all this way to hide, Gabriel. I'm going to face this head-on." The private elevator took them directly to the 40th floor. Angela, Richard's assistant, greeted them with a professional smile and guided them to the main conference room. Through the glass walls, Hannah could see the city stretching to the horizon, a view that in other times they had dreamed of sharing. Richard was already in the room, along with Charles Edwards and 3 other executives. When he saw her enter, he instinctively stood up, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by anyone. For a brief moment, their gazes met, and the air seemed to grow thicker. "Ms. Carter, Mr. Torres, welcome." Charles Edwards took the initiative, breaking the moment of tension. "We are very interested in learning more about your proposal." Hannah took control of the situation with a naturalness that impressed even Richard. As she presented the technical details of the renewable energy project developed by HC Tech, her voice showed no sign of the shared history with the man sitting across from her. "Our technology allows for a 40% reduction in energy consumption, with a return on investment in less than 2 years, Hannah explained, her fingers gliding precisely over the tablet as graphs and projections were displayed on the screen. "We've already implemented pilot projects in 3 European countries, with results above expectations." Richard observed her every move, torn between professional admiration and a deep pain that seemed to grow with each passing minute. Hannah was different from everything he had known. Her confidence wasn't just a facade, but the result of years of hard work and perseverance. During the presentation, Gabriel complimented Hannah's explanations with technical data, and Richard couldn't help but notice the synergy between the two. It was evident that they formed a solid partnership, built on mutual respect and trust, exactly what he and Hannah could have been. "And what about the implementation process?" asked one of the directors. "What would be the estimated timeline?" 6 months for the initial phase, Hannah replied. And then, for the first time since the start of the meeting, she addressed Richard directly. "Of course, this will depend on Morgan Enterprises' commitment to the necessary changes. Some companies have difficulty abandoning old habits, even when it's clear that it's time to move forward." The double meaning of her words didn't escape anyone in the room. Richard felt his face heat up, but maintained his professional composure. "Morgan Enterprises has always been at the forefront of innovation, Ms. Carter. We wouldn't have gotten where we are if we clung to the past." "Interesting point, Mr. Morgan," Hannah responded, a slight ironic smile playing on her lips. "Sometimes I wonder if people really change, or if they just learn to hide better behind more elaborate facades." The air in the room grew even heavier. Charles Edwards cleared his throat, trying to disperse the tension. "Well, I think the benefits of the project are evident. Could we discuss the contractual details next week?" "Certainly," Gabriel replied, casting a concerned look at Hannah. "Our legal team can prepare a draft of the contract." As the other executives said their goodbyes and left the room, Richard remained in his seat. Hannah organized her documents, with deliberately slow movements, as if waiting for everyone to leave. Gabriel hesitated at the door, but she made a small gesture with her head, indicating that he could go. Finally alone, the silence between them weighed like lead. Richard was the first to break it. "Your project is exceptional, Hannah. You've achieved something truly impressive." "I've achieved much more than a successful project, Richard," she replied, finally looking at him directly. "I managed to rebuild myself after you destroyed everything we had planned." Richard took a step in her direction, but she raised her hand, maintaining the distance between them. "Please, don't confuse things. I'm here strictly for business." "No, I don't deserve your forgiveness," he began, his voice betraying the emotion he was trying to contain. "But I need you to know that not a day goes by that I don't regret what I did." Hannah laughed, a bitter sound that didn't match her elegant posture. "Regret? It's easy to regret when you're at the top, isn't it? When you've already achieved everything you wanted. Do you know how long it took me to be able to sleep through the night after that day? Do you know how many times I had to hear people whispering behind my back, looking at me with pity?" Her words hit Richard like precise arrows. "Hannah, No, Richard. You don't have the right to try to explain yourself now. You know what's ironic? You did me a favor that day. If you had married me, I probably would have been content being Mrs. Morgan, living in your shadow. But by abandoning me, you forced me to discover my own strength." She began to walk towards the door, but paused for a moment. "If we decide to proceed with the partnership, it will be purely for commercial reasons. There's nothing more between us beyond that. And if I said I still love you..." The words escaped Richard's lips before he could contain them. Hannah turned slowly, her eyes shining with a mixture of anger and sadness. "Then I would say that you don't know what love is, Richard. Love is courage. It's choosing someone even when the world says you shouldn't. You chose your world of appearances, and I chose my freedom. Now live with it." With these words, she left the room, leaving Richard alone with the weight of his choices. Through the windows, the afternoon sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and red, the same colors that had decorated the church on that fateful morning 10 years ago. Richard loosened his tie, feeling suffocated. In the window's reflection, he saw the image of a man who had everything money could buy, but who had lost something much more valuable. Hannah was right. He hadn't changed. He had only built a more elaborate facade to hide his fear. His cell. Phone vibrated. It was another message from his mother. "Richard, we need to talk about Hannah. Don't do anything foolish." He looked at the message for a long moment before turning off the device. His mother, always trying to control his life, always knowing what was best for him. How much of his own happiness had he sacrificed to meet her expectations? At that moment, sitting alone in his conference room overlooking the city, Richard Morgan finally began to understand the true cost of his choices. It wasn't just Hannah he had lost that day. It was also his own courage, his authenticity, his ability to truly love. The day after the meeting at Morgan Enterprises, Hannah found herself in her own office at HC Tech, a modern space in the heart of New York's financial district. Unlike Richard's ostentatious luxury, her work environment reflected her personality, elegant yet welcoming, with glass walls that let in natural light and plants strategically placed throughout the space. "Are you okay?" Gabriel asked, entering, without knocking, a privilege that years of friendship and partnership had afforded him. "You've been different since yesterday." Hannah sighed, turning in her chair to face the city view. "I'm trying to understand why it still affects me so much after all this time. I thought I was completely over it." Gabriel sat in the chair in front of her desk, his face showing genuine concern. "Maybe because some wounds never fully heal. They just learn to hurt less." "You know what's most ironic?" Hannah turned to face him. "When he abandoned me, I swore that one day I'd make him regret it. I built all of this." She gestured around, indicating her business empire, partially motivated by this desire to prove my worth. "And now that I've finally seen him broken, regretful, I don't feel the satisfaction I expected." The phone on her desk rang, interrupting the conversation. It was her secretary. "Ms. Carter, Business and Ventures magazine is on the line. They want an interview about the possible deal with Morgan Enterprises." Hannah frowned. How quickly news traveled in the corporate world. "Tell them I'll call back later, please." Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Richard was walking through the corridors of his mansion in the Hamptons, too restless to sleep, too disturbed to work. Hannah's words echoed in his mind. Love is courage. It's choosing someone even when the world says you shouldn't. The sound of the doorbell yanked him from his thoughts. It was his mother, Elizabeth Morgan, impeccable in her Chanel suit, carrying that look of disapproval he knew so well. "Son, we need to talk," she declared, entering without waiting for an invitation. "You can't seriously be considering doing business with that woman." Richard felt a wave of irritation rise in his chest. "That woman, Mom, has a name. It's Hannah Carter, and she's built one of the most innovative companies in the country." "I don't care what she's built," Elizabeth retorted, sitting elegantly on the living room sofa. "She doesn't belong in our world. She never did. That's why I made you see reality 10 years ago, and thank God you had the good sense to listen to me." Her mother's words hit Richard like a slap. For the first time, he clearly saw how he had allowed her to manipulate his decisions, how he had sacrificed his happiness to maintain the appearances of a life he never really wanted. "No, Mom," he said, his voice firm. "I didn't. Have good sense. I was a coward, and you helped destroy the only true thing I ever had in my life." Elizabeth stood up, shocked by her son's response. "How dare you speak to me like that? Everything I did was for your own good. Look at all you've achieved, at the man you've become." "What man have I become, Mom? A man who doesn't have the courage to follow his heart? A man who lives surrounded by luxury but has no one to share it with? Is that what you call achievement?" In H.C. Tech's office, Hannah was reviewing the terms of the contract with Morgan Enterprises when her cell phone vibrated. It was a message from her younger sister, Claire. "Sis, I just saw the news about the possible partnership with Richard's company. Are you okay? Want to talk?" Hannah smiled sadly. Claire had been her safe harbor during the most difficult months after the cancelled wedding. It was she who convinced Hannah to turn her pain into fuel, to use the money she had saved for the wedding as initial capital for her first venture. "I'm fine," Hannah replied, stronger than ever. But was she really? The question echoed in her mind as she observed the city below. The sun was setting, and the lights of the buildings were beginning to turn on, creating a mosaic of life and movement. Somewhere in that city was a man who had once been her entire world, and who now was nothing more than a business contract on her desk. Gabriel returned to her office at the end of the day, carrying 2 cups of coffee. The lawyers finished reviewing the contract. "Everything is in order to proceed with the partnership. Do you still want to go ahead?" Hannah took the coffee, allowing the familiar aroma to calm her. "It's a good deal, Gabriel. I can't let personal feelings interfere with a business decision." "Can't or won't?" he asked gently. "Hannah, I've known you for years. I know when you're hiding behind that facade of a ruthless businesswoman." She put the coffee on the desk and stood up, walking to the window. The city was now fully lit, a sea of light stretching as far as the eye could see. "You know what scares me most, Gabriel? It's not the fact that I still feel something when I see him. It's realizing that after all this time, after everything I've built, a part of me still wonders, what if?" In the Morgan mansion, Richard watched his mother leave after a discussion that had shaken the foundations of their relationship. For the first time in his life, he had taken a stand against her, had defended his own feelings. But was it too late? His phone rang. It was Charles Edwards. "Morgan, the press is already speculating about the partnership with H.C. Tech. We need an official position. Are you going to proceed with the project?" Richard looked at the family portrait on his living room wall. Him, his parents, his sister, all smiling those rehearsed smiles of people who lived to keep up appearances. How much of his life had he wasted trying to be the perfect son, the perfect businessman, the perfect heir? "Yes," he finally answered. "We're going ahead with the project. And Charles, prepare the documents for a restructuring of the board. It's time for some changes around here." As night fell over New York City, 2 lonely souls in different parts of the city faced their own truths. Hannah in her modern office, realizing that all her success hadn't been enough to completely fill the void left by the past. And Richard in his luxurious mansion, finally finding the courage to start dismantling the walls he had built around himself. Fate, which had separated them so cruelly, now reconnected them through a business contract. But was it possible to rebuild something that had been broken so devastatingly? Could the scars of the past one day transform into bridges to the future? The news of the restructuring at Morgan Enterprises hit the financial market like a bombshell. Richard had announced significant changes to the board, including the departure of executives who had been with the company for decades, close friends of his father and mother. The Wall Street Journal splashed across its front page, "Morgan Enterprises undergoes biggest transformation in 30-year history." In his office, Richard stared at the computer screen where dozens of emails protested against his decisions. The C. Most recent was from his father, Alexander Morgan, who had retired 5 years ago. "Son, what madness is this? You're destroying the legacy we built." For the first time in his adult life, Richard felt truly free. Each indignant email, each disapproving phone call only confirmed that he was finally making his own decisions. "Mr. Morgan," Angela entered the office with a worried expression. "Your mother is here. She didn't make an appointment, but you can send her in, Angela," Richard replied, preparing himself for another battle. Elizabeth Morgan entered like a hurricane, throwing a series of newspapers onto Richard's desk. "Have you completely lost your mind? First this story about a partnership with Hannah, now you're firing people who are practically family?" Richard calmly stood up, walked to the window, and observed the city for a few moments before responding. "Mum, please sit down. We need to have a conversation that should have happened a long time ago." Surprised by her son's calmness, Elizabeth sat down. "For years," he began, "I lived the life that you and Dad planned for me. Every decision, every choice was shaped by what you considered appropriate for the Morgan name, including—" his voice faltered slightly, "including the decision to abandon the only person who truly loved me for who I was, not for my last name." "Richard, don't start with that story again." "No, Mum, now you're going to listen to me," he interrupted her, his voice firm but controlled. "On that day, 10 years ago, I not only hurt Hannah, I killed a part of myself. The part that knew what it was to be true, that had the courage to dream beyond social appearances." On the other side of the city at HC Tech, Hannah was also facing the consequences of the changes at Morgan Enterprises. Several shareholders had contacted her, concerned about the impact the restructuring could have on the partnership between the companies. "The numbers don't lie," she explained during a video conference with her investors. "Morgan Enterprises remains solid, and the changes proposed by Richard, by Mr. Morgan, actually strengthen our partnership." Gabriel, who was accompanying the meeting, noticed how she had stumbled over Richard's name. After the video conference, he closed the door of the room and faced his friend. "You knew he would do this, didn't you?" he asked. "That's why you insisted on going ahead with the partnership even after that confrontation." Hannah nervously fiddled with her pearl necklace. "I saw something in his eyes during our meeting, Gabriel. Something that reminded me of the Richard I knew in college, before the weight of the Morgan name transformed him into someone else." At Morgan Enterprises, the conversation between mother and son continued. "You're throwing away years of your father's hard work," Elizabeth argued, "all because of an adolescent feeling that should have been left in the past." Richard shook his head, a sad smile on his lips. "No, Mum, I'm finally honoring Dad's true legacy, the courage to build something from scratch. Only, unlike him, I'm not going to sacrifice my happiness in the process." He walked to his desk and picked up a photo frame that he had kept face down for years. It was a picture of him with Hannah, taken during a trip to Cape Cod. They were smiling, carefree, sitting at the edge of a pier. "Look at this photo, Mom," he said, handing the frame to Elizabeth. "Look into my eyes in this image. When was the last time you saw me smile like that?" Elizabeth observed the photograph for a long moment, and something in her expression subtly changed. Perhaps for the first time, she was really seeing her son, not the heir to the Morgans, but simply Richard. "What exactly do you intend to do?" she asked, her voice softer. "Transform the company into something that reflects not just profits but real values. The partnership with HC Tech is just the beginning. Hannah, she built something extraordinary, based on innovation and sustainability. That's the future I want for Morgan Enterprises." At HC Tech, Hannah received an unexpected call from Claire, her sister. "I saw the news about Morgan Enterprises," Claire said. "Richard is really changing everything over there." "So it seems," Hannah replied, trying to keep her voice neutral. "Sis," Claire hesitated for a moment, "do you remember what you told me after that day at the church? That Richard never had enough courage to fight for what he really wanted?" Hannah felt her heart tighten. "I remember." "Well, it looks like he finally found that courage, even if it's too late." Claire's words echoed in Hannah's mind for the rest of the day. As she reviewed the final details of the partnership contract, her mind wandered to memories of the past. Not the painful ones of abandonment, but the old ones, from when they were just two young dreamers with the future ahead of them. At the end of that day, Richard did something he hadn't done in years. He left the office early and drove to the neighborhood where he had lived with Hannah during college. The small cafe where they used to study was still there, although now it was a modern and trendy establishment. He sat at a table near the window, the same one where years ago Hannah had drawn on a napkin the logo of the company she dreamed of creating. At the time he had smiled, finding her naivety adorable. Now that same logo was emblazoned on a business empire. His cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Charles Edwards. "The changes are generating more buzz than we expected. The press wants a press conference. We need you and Hannah together to officially announce the partnership." Richard reread the message several times, his heart racing. A press conference meant another encounter with Hannah, another chance to show her that he was really changing. Meanwhile, in Hannah's apartment in Soho, she observed the city from her balcony, a glass of red wine in her hands. Her cell phone had also just received the message about the press conference. Gabriel, who had stopped by to discuss some details of the contract, noticed her pensive expression. "You know," he said, "sometimes the universe gives us second chances, not to go back to who we were, but to prove that we've learned from our experiences." Hannah took a sip of wine, letting her friend's words sink into her heart. "The problem, Gabriel, is that I don't know if I'm ready to find out if this change in Richard is real or just another facade." Night fell over New York City, enveloping the metropolis in a blanket of lights that seemed like earthly stars. In different parts of the city, two people who once shared dreams now faced the possibility of a new beginning, not as the naive, young people they were, but as adults who carried scars and lessons learned. The morning of the press conference dawned with a light drizzle typical of New York City. Hannah woke up before her alarm, her hands automatically reaching for the pearl necklace on her nightstand, a ritual that had become her lucky charm over the years. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone," Claire said on the phone, as Hannah got ready. "You've shown your strength 1,000 times." "It's not about proving something," Hannah replied, adjusting her emerald green blazer in front of the mirror. "It's about not allowing the past to continue dictating my reactions." Bindi, Richard's penthouse. He was also preparing for the decisive day. He had spent much of the night awake, mentally reviewing not only the speech for the press, but every word he wanted to say to Hannah. Words that, perhaps, he would never have the courage to utter. "Mr. Morgan," Angela called him through the intercom. "The car is waiting and the press officers are already at the conference location." The event would be held in the auditorium of the Four Seasons Hotel, one of the city's most iconic locations. The choice of venue hadn't been by chance. It was the same hotel where 10 years ago their wedding reception should have taken place. Hannah arrived first, accompanied by Gabriel and her team. The hotel lobby was filled with journalists and photographers, all eager to capture the moment when two of the most prominent figures in the American market would announce their partnership. "Take a deep breath," Gabriel whispered, noticing how she was clutching the document folder tighter than necessary. "You've faced much tougher meetings than this." "Business meetings are different," she responded quietly. "In those, I don't have to pretend I don't see ghosts in every corner." When Richard arrived 15 minutes later, the buzz in the lobby increased considerably. He had chosen a navy blue suit that, coincidentally or not, was very similar to the one he would have worn at his wedding a decade ago. Their eyes met across the lobby, and for a moment, the world seemed to slow down. Hannah felt her heart skip involuntarily when she noticed he was wearing the tie she had given him on their last birthday together, a detail so specific that only she would recognize. "Good morning, Ms. Carter," Richard greeted formally, approaching with Charles Edwards by his side. "I hope you're prepared to face the vultures." A small smile appeared at the corner of Hannah's lips. Vultures was what they used to call journalists during their college days. "Perfectly prepared, Mr. Morgan," she replied, maintaining a professional tone, though her eyes betrayed a glimmer of recognition at the reference. The conference was about to begin when a commotion at the hotel entrance caught everyone's attention. Elizabeth Morgan had arrived, accompanied by Alexander, Richard's father. They hadn't been invited. "Mom, Dad, what are you doing here?" Richard asked, trying to keep his voice low as he approached them. "We've come to prevent you from making another mistake," Elizabeth declared, her tone making it clear she didn't care about causing a scene. "This partnership, these changes, you're destroying everything we've built." Hannah observed the scene from afar, her heart racing. She watched as Richard gently but firmly held his mother's arm, leading her to a more private place, along with his father. Gabriel approached her. "Want to postpone the conference?" "No," Hannah replied, her voice firm. "I won't let them interfere with business decisions, not anymore." In the most discreet corner of the lobby, Richard confronted his parents. "Son," Alexander spoke for the first time, his voice softer than Elizabeth's. "Your mother is worried. And I confess I am too. All these changes so sudden." "Sudden?" Richard laughed humorlessly. "Dad, these changes should have happened 10 years ago when I allowed you to convince me to give up the only person who truly made me happy." "Don't be dramatic," Elizabeth cut in. "You had relationships after her. What about Marina, that nutritionist from a traditional family you dated last year?" "Empty relationships, Mom. People you approved of because they fit your standard of social perfection. But you know what the difference is? Hannah never needed your approval. She conquered her own space, built something bigger than any of us imagined possible." On the EAMP auditorium stage, technicians were making final adjustments. Hannah reviewed her notes, but her mind was on the family drama unfolding a few meters away. Through the glass doors, she could see Elizabeth's exalted gestures, Richard's tense posture, Alexander's worried expression. "2 minutes until we start," announced one of the press officers. Richard looked at his parents, a new determination in his gaze. "You can choose. Stay and support the changes I'm implementing, or leave and accept that I'm no longer that son who bends to all your wishes." To everyone's surprise, it was Alexander who answered first. "We'll stay, but I want you to know that I don't agree with many of these changes." "I'm not asking you to agree, Dad, just to respect them." When Richard finally took the stage, positioning himself next to Hannah in front of the cameras and microphones, something had changed. His posture was different, lighter, as if an invisible weight had been removed from his shoulders. Hannah immediately noticed the change. It was as if for the first time in 10 years, she was really seeing Richard. Not the Morganaire, not the successful businessman, but the man she had once known and loved. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice clear and firm. "We're here today to announce not just a business partnership, but a new era for Morgan Enterprises." As he spoke, Hannah observed him with renewed attention. Every word, every gesture seemed loaded with deeper meaning. When it was her turn to speak, their voices complemented each other in a way that didn't go unnoticed by the journalists present. "It's as if they had rehearsed together for years," one reporter commented quietly to his colleague. If he only knew that, in a way, they really had rehearsed, not with words or meetings, but with years of shared history, interrupted dreams, and a love that, apparently, had refused to die completely. The headlines the day after the press conference didn't just focus on the multi-million-dollar partnership between Morgan Enterprises and HC Tech. The journalists, with their nose for stories beyond the numbers, had caught something more. "Is the chemistry between CEOs more than just business?" questioned one of the most shared articles. Hannah was browsing the news on her tablet during breakfast in her apartment when she received a message from Claire. "So, that look during the conference didn't seem very professional to me." Little, sighing, Hannah put the tablet aside and walked to the balcony. The city was already pulsing in its frantic rhythm below, but her mind was on the unspoken words of the previous day. The exchanged glances, the small gestures that apparently hadn't gone unnoticed. Her phone rang. It was Gabriel. "Have you seen the news?" he asked without preamble. "Impossible not to see," she replied, watching a plane cross the New York sky. "But they're just empty speculations." "Hannah," Gabriel's voice took on that tone she knew well, the tone of someone about to say an uncomfortable truth. "You still love him, don't you?" The silence that followed was more eloquent than any response. At Morgan Enterprises, Richard was also facing the repercussions of the conference. But unlike what many expected, the company's stocks had risen significantly. The market had responded positively to the announced changes and the partnership with HC Tech. "The investors are impressed," commented Charles Edwards, entering Richard's office with a series of reports. "They say they've never seen you so confident and convincing in a presentation." Richard swiveled in his chair, facing the city through his office windows. "Maybe because, for the first time, I really believe in what I'm doing." His cell phone vibrated with a notification, another article about the press conference. This one, however, was different. A columnist had done a retrospective, recalling the almost wedding from 10 years ago and speculating on how fate had brought the two executives back together. As he read, Richard allowed himself to remember the moment during the conference when Hannah had slightly stumbled over a word. Without thinking, he had completed the sentence for her in a gesture so natural it seemed rehearsed. The audience applauded, interpreting it as a demonstration of the synergy between the business partners. But for them, it had been a moment of genuine connection, an echo of simpler times. "Your father is here," Angela announced over the intercom, interrupting his thoughts. To his surprise, Alexander Morgan entered alone, without Elizabeth, without his usual authoritarian posture. "Son," he began, sitting in front of Richard's desk, "I came to apologize for the scene yesterday." Richard raised his eyebrows, surprised. In 35 years, he had never heard his father apologize for anything. "You know," Alexander continued, "yesterday, seeing you and Hannah together on that stage, it reminded me of how I was when I met your mother." "What do you mean?" "I used to be like that too, son. Determined, passionate, full of ideals. But at some point along the way, I let the expectations of others, of society, of her family, start dictating my choices. And when I realized it, I had become exactly the kind of person I swore I'd never be." At HC Tech, Hannah was conducting a meeting with her development team when her secretary interrupted. "Ms. Carter, I'm sorry for the interruption, but something arrived for you." It was a small package, elegantly presented in craft paper with a golden ribbon. Inside was a framed napkin, the same napkin where years ago she had drawn the first sketch of the HC Tech logo. The note accompanying it simply said, "I always believed in you even when I didn't have the courage to show it." Ah, Hannah felt her heart race. How had he managed to preserve that napkin all these years? "I need a moment," she told her team, quickly leaving the meeting room. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. She remembered that afternoon in the cafe, the enthusiasm with which she explained her dreams to Richard, how he looked at her with a mixture of admiration and affection as she scribbled her ideas on the napkin. Her phone vibrated. It was a message from Richard. "Can we talk?" No cameras, no reporters, no expectations, just talk. In the office of Morgan Enterprises, Richard anxiously awaited the response, recalling the conversation with his father. "When I saw you two yesterday," Alexander had said, "I realized I was making the same mistake with you that I made with myself, trying to shape your life according to expectations that aren't yours." "Dad." "Let me finish, son. Your mother, she's still going to take a while to accept the changes, but I want you to know that even if I don't agree with everything, I'm proud to see you finally following your own path." Richard's phone vibrated. It was Hannah's response. "Rooftop of the Highline Hotel, 7 p.m., the place where it all began." His heart raced. The Highline Hotel had been where they met during their first year of college. Hannah had spilled coffee on his economics books, and he, instead of getting angry, had joked that she was just trying to make the content more interesting. As the afternoon progressed, both Hannah and Richard tried to concentrate on their respective meetings and commitments, but their thoughts kept returning to the scheduled meeting. Gabriel, noticing Hannah's distraction, approached her desk at the end of the day. "Are you really going to meet him?" "I need to, Gabriel. Not for him, but for me. There are questions that have gone unanswered for too long." In his office, Richard received one last visit before leaving, Charles Edwards. "Morgan, the lawyers have finalized the partnership contracts. We just need your signature and Hannah's to—" "Tomorrow, Charles," Richard gently interrupted him. "Today I have a more important commitment." The sun was beginning to set over New York when Hannah parked her car near the High Line Hotel. The Phoebe place had been restored, but maintained much of its original charm from the 1920s. The marble tables, the wrought iron chairs, the mosaic floor. Everything there told stories of meetings and farewells. Through the window, she could see Richard, already seated at a table on the rooftop, exactly where they had met so many years ago. He had exchanged his work suit for a light blue shirt and dark pants, a more relaxed version of the executive the world knew. Taking a deep breath, Hannah adjusted her pearl necklace, her gesture of security, and walked towards the hotel. Each step took her not just to meet Richard, but to meet her own past, interrupted dreams and perhaps possibilities that had never really died. The bell of the High Line Hotel's rooftop bar chimed softly as Hannah stepped out onto the terrace. The familiar aroma of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries brought a wave of memories. How many afternoons had she and Richard spent here, sharing dreams over cups of coffee? Richard saw her before she spotted him. He watched her navigate between the tables with that natural elegance that had always characterized her. Now refined by years of corporate leadership, she wore a simple but elegant navy blue dress and the inevitable pearl necklace. "Do you still take your cappuccino with cinnamon?" he asked as she approached, standing to pull out her chair for her, a gesture that belonged more to the past than the present. Hannah smiled slightly, surprised he remembered such a small detail. "Some things never change, and others change completely," he replied, gesturing to the waiter. After they placed their orders, a cinnamon cappuccino for her, a plain espresso for him, exactly like old times, a silence settled between them. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but one laden with unspoken words. "The napkin," Hannah began, her hand unconsciously touching the small purse where she had stored it. "How did you keep it all these years?" Richard took a deep breath, his fingers lightly drumming on the marble table. "I kept everything, Hannah. Every photo, every note, every little memento. They were in a box in my closet. I couldn't look at them, but I also couldn't get rid of them." "Why?" The question hung between them, carrying the weight of 10 years of absence. "Because they were proof that at some point in my life I was truly happy. Not the kind of happiness you display in social columns or financial reports, but that genuine happiness that comes from simply being who you are." The waiter arrived with their coffees, providing a brief moment of pause. Hannah watched the cinnamon form patterns in the foam of her cappuccino, gathering her thoughts. "You know what's ironic?" she finally said. "For years I convinced myself that I hated you. I built HC Tech with that anger as fuel. I wanted to prove that I was more than the abandoned bride, more than the girl from the suburbs who wasn't good enough for the Morgan family. You were always more than enough, Hannah. I was the one who was less courageous, less authentic, less free." "And now?" she asked, her eyes finally meeting his. "What's changed?" Richard picked up his coffee cup but didn't drink. He just held it, as if he needed something to anchor his hands. "I realized that I spent 10 years trying to be the person everyone expected me to be, and in the process, I lost who I really was. It took you coming back into my life for me to understand that success without authenticity is just a pretty form of failure." A gentle breeze blew across the rooftop, lightly ruffling Hannah's hair. The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the New York City skyline in shades of pink and orange. "When I saw you at that charity event," he continued, It was as if time had stopped and moved forward simultaneously. You were different, stronger, more confident, but your eyes still had that sparkle that made me fall in love with you in college. Hannah felt her heart race, but maintained her composure. Richard, we can't simply turn back time. A lot has happened. A lot has changed. I'm not asking to turn back time, he responded, his voice soft but firm. I'm asking for a chance to get to know you now as you are today. The Hannah who built an empire, who revolutionized the market, who proved that I was a fool for ever doubting her. You didn't doubt me, she corrected, a touch of bitterness in her voice. You doubted us, our ability to face the world together. Richard extended his hand across the table, not quite touching hers but close enough to feel her warmth. You're right, and that was my biggest mistake. But you know what I learned watching you these past few days? I learned that true love isn't about facing the world together. It's about giving each other strength so that each can face their own challenges. Hannah felt her eyes fill with tears, but she didn't let them fall. Beautiful words, Richard. But words are easy. That's why I didn't come here with grand promises or dramatic declarations. I came because for the first time in 10 years I'm being honest, with myself and with you. The waiter approached, asking if they wanted anything else. Both shook their heads negatively, grateful for the brief interruption that allowed them to recompose their emotions. Did you know I never got married? Hannah said suddenly. I had relationships, of course, but I never allowed anyone to get close enough to really know me. Gabriel says I built a fortress around myself. And is he wrong? No, she admitted, a sad smile playing on her lips. The fortress protected me, allowed me to build everything I've built. But sometimes I wonder if it also prevented me from living fully. Richard nodded, understanding perfectly. I married Morgan Enterprises. Every decision, every calculated move to keep up appearances, to not disappoint anyone. Except that in the process I disappointed the most important person, myself. The sky was now almost completely dark, the city lights beginning to shine like earthly stars. The rooftop was emptier, creating a bubble of intimacy around them. Why did you call me here today, Richard? Really? He looked at her for a long moment before answering. Because I needed you to know that the napkin wasn't the only thing I preserved all these years. I also preserved hope, not of going back to what we were, but of one day deserving to know who you've become. Hannah felt something inside her shift, like a wall beginning to crack. And if the person I've become isn't who you expect, the person you've become is already more than I could ever expect, Hannah. The question is the person I'm becoming, now finally being true to myself, someone you would consider getting to know? The rooftop door chimed again as a new customer entered, bringing with them a gust of the New York night air. Hannah shivered slightly, and Richard automatically took off his jacket and offered it to her, another echo from the past that seemed strangely appropriate in the present. I don't know, she answered honestly, accepting the jacket. But maybe I'm willing to find out. The week following the meeting at the Highline Hotel was a whirlwind of emotions and discoveries for Hannah and Richard. The words exchanged that night had removed layers of protection built over a decade, leaving them vulnerable, but strangely lighter. Hannah was in her office at HC Tech, reviewing some documents, when Gabriel entered without knocking as usual. She was still wearing Richard's jacket, a detail that didn't escape her friend's attentive gaze. So, he began, sitting in front of her desk. Are you going to tell me how the meeting went, or do I have to find out from the gossip columns? Hannah smiled, closing the folder she was analyzing. There was nothing dramatic for the papers to report, Gabriel, just an honest conversation. An honest conversation that made you late for the first time in 5 years to yesterday's meeting. She blushed slightly, remembering how she had lost track of time that morning, distracted by thoughts about the previous night. I was reorganizing some priorities. Hannah Carter reorganizing priorities? Gabriel feigned shock. Who are you and what have you done with my workaholic friend? At Morgan Enterprises, Richard was also facing his own revelations. He had arrived at the office earlier and for the first time in years redecorated his office. The formal photos with politicians and businessmen were replaced by more personal images, including a discreet photo of him with Hannah at the hotel, taken by a waiter the night before. "Mr. Morgan," Angela interrupted him through the intercom, "for your mother is here." Richard took a deep breath, preparing himself for another confrontation, but when Elizabeth Morgan entered the room, something in her expression was different. "Son," she began, her voice softer than usual, "I talked to your father last night. For hours, actually." Richard gestured for her to sit down, intrigued by her tone. "He made me see something I've been ignoring for years," Elizabeth continued. "How much you resemble him when he was your age. The same determination, the same sparkle in your eyes when you talk about something you believe in." "Mom, let me finish, please. Your father told me about his own regrets, about how he allowed others' expectations to shape his choices, and he made me realize that we were doing the same to you." Meanwhile, at HC Tech, Hannah received an unexpected visit. Claire had shown up unexpectedly, carrying 2 cups of their favorite coffee. "So, little sis," Claire said, handing one of the coffees to Hannah. "Gabriel told me you've been different since yesterday." "Lighter," he said, "as if you'd finally let go of a weight you'd been carrying." Hannah took the cup, inhaling the familiar aroma of cinnamon cappuccino. "It's strange, you know. For years I built my professional life as a way to prove my worth to Richard, to his family, to myself. But yesterday, talking to him, I realized I don't have anything left to prove." "And is that good or bad?" "It's liberating," Hannah replied after a moment of reflection, "as if I could finally just be myself without all the armor I built." In Richard's office, the conversation with his mother continued. "When I saw you two at that press conference," Elizabeth said, "I noticed something I had forgotten. The way your eyes light up when she's around. It's the same sparkle you had in college before we interfered." "Why are you telling me this now, Mom?" "Because yesterday, after talking with your father, I went to that old box in the attic. I found photos of you from your college days. In all of them you were smiling, a genuine smile, not the one we rehearse for social photos. And I realized I haven't seen that smile in 10 years. Richard felt his eyes sting. "Isn't it too late to be happy?" "It's never too late, son. It took me 60 years to understand this, but I finally did." At HC Tech, Hannah received a text message from Richard. "Dinner tonight? No coffee this time. I know a place you'll like." Before she could respond, Claire snatched the phone from her hands, read the message, and smiled. "If you don't accept, I'll respond for you myself." "Claire," Hannah tried to recover the phone, laughing like she hadn't in years. "It's not that simple, isn't it?" Claire raised an eyebrow. "Seems pretty simple to me. He's trying. You're lighter than ever. What else do you need?" At the end of the afternoon, Richard was in a meeting with Charles Edwards when his cell phone vibrated with Hannah's response. 7:30 p.m. "But this time I choose the wine." An involuntary smile appeared on his lips, making Charles Edwards interrupt his presentation. "Morgan, is everything all right?" "Better than all right, Charles," he replied, putting away his phone. "For the first time in a long time, everything is exactly as it should be." In her office, Hannah looked out the window, watching the sun begin to set over the city. Gabriel had just left, not without first commenting on how she looked younger when she smiled like that. Her reflection in the window glass showed a woman different from the relentless executive everyone knew. She was still wearing Richard's jacket, and her grandmother's pearl necklace shimmered softly in the twilight. "Sometimes," she murmured to herself, repeating her grandmother's words, "the universe needs to break us to rebuild us stronger." Her phone rang. It was Helen, her assistant. "Ms. Carter, the final contracts for the partnership with Morgan Enterprises just arrived for your signature." Hannah smiled, a serene smile that carried the wisdom of someone who finally understood that sometimes we need to lose everything to find something greater. "You can leave them on my desk, Helen. I'll sign them tomorrow." "But Mom, I thought it was urgent." "Some things are more important than urgencies. Hannah replied, picking up her purse. "And sometimes we need to give destiny the time it deserves." 6 months had passed since that night at the Highline Hotel. The partnership between Morgan Enterprises and HC Tech had proven to be a resounding success, revolutionizing the sustainable energy market in the United States. But the greatest transformations weren't in the numbers or the headlines of economic newspapers. It was a Sunday afternoon, and Central Park was filled with families enjoying the mild autumn sun. Hannah walked beside Richard near the lake, their fingers naturally intertwined, as if they had never been apart. "Remember the last time we came here?" she asked, stopping to observe a group of ducks swimming near the shore. "How could I forget?" Richard smiled, gently squeezing her hand. "It's where you told me about your dream of creating a sustainable technology company. I thought it was crazy at the time. And now I know that the only crazy thing was not believing in us more." They continued walking, passing cyclists and joggers, families having picnics, and artists painting the landscape. The bustling city seemed distant from this small oasis of tranquility. "Hannah," Richard stopped under a large tree, turning to face her. "I need to tell you something." She raised an eyebrow, noticing the seriousness in his voice. "What is it?" "I'm going to step down from the presidency of Morgan Enterprises." Hannah's eyes widened in surprise. "What do you mean? Why?" "Because I realized that I spent so much time trying to prove my worth through the company that I forgot to build a life of my own. Charles Edwards is more than prepared to take over, and I want to start over, from scratch." Richard Morgan wanting to start from scratch. Hannah smiled, gently touching his face. "Who are you, and what have you done with that status-obsessed businessman?" "Let's say a certain successful businesswoman taught me that true success isn't measured by the size of the empire, but by the peace we feel at the end of the day." At that moment, as if the universe wanted to participate in the conversation, a gentle breeze shook the leaves of the tree under which they stood, causing a golden shower of autumn leaves to fall over them. "And your parents? How did they react?" Richard laughed, a light and genuine sound that still surprised Hannah. "My mother almost had a fit, of course, but my father, he hugged me and said he was proud. Said that finally a Morgan had the courage to choose happiness over appearances." Hannah rested her head on his shoulder, watching the people passing by. An elderly lady smiled at them, as if recognizing in them a love that time couldn't erase. "And now, what's the plan?" "Well," Richard began, a mischievous glint in his eyes, "I've been thinking about creating something new, a foundation maybe. Something that combines the business knowledge I've acquired with social and sustainable projects. And I was waiting for the right moment to make you an invitation." "What kind of invitation?" Hannah asked, though she already knew the answer. "How about joining forces, not as Morgan and Carter, not as presidents of big companies, but as Richard and Hannah, two dreamers who finally learned that the greatest success is having the courage to be who we really are." Hannah felt her eyes fill with tears, but this time she didn't try to hold them back. They were tears of joy, of liberation, of a love that had matured and transformed into something deeper and truer. "You know what's funny?" she said, wiping away a tear. "I spent years building HC Tech to prove I could be successful on my own, and now I realize that true success isn't in walking alone, but in consciously choosing who we want to share the journey with." Richard pulled her closer, gently kissing her forehead. "So is that a yes?" "It's a let's build something together," she replied, smiling. This time not out of obligation or expectations, but by choice. At that moment, Hannah's cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Gabriel. "Important meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. Don't be late again." She showed the message to Richard, laughing. "I think he still hasn't gotten used to my occasional tardiness." "Maybe because the Hannah Carter he knew never allowed herself to be late," Richard commented. "The Hannah Carter he knew also never allowed herself to be truly happy," she replied, putting away the phone without responding to the message. "Some things need to change." They continued their walk through the park, now heading towards where they had parked. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange that reflected in the lake waters. "Hannah," Richard stopped again, turning to her. "There's one more thing I want to ask you." She noticed that he seemed nervous, something rare to see in the always controlled Richard Morgan. 10 years ago, I made the biggest mistake of my life in that church. Not because I gave up on the wedding, but because I gave up on us before we even had a real chance. Now, after all this time, after all the transformations we've been through, I want to ask you a different question." Hannah felt her heart race as he took her hands in his. "I don't want to ask you to marry me, not now. What I want is to ask your permission to win you back, day after day, moment after moment. Permission for us to build something new, at our own pace, in our own way. No pressures, no external expectations, just the two of us discovering together what we can be." The last lights of the day danced in her eyes as she responded, "You know what the biggest lesson I learned in these 10 years was, Richard? That sometimes we need to lose everything to understand what really matters. And what matters isn't the destination, but the journey. It's not the goal, but the path. It's not the happy ending, but each small moment of happiness we build together." She moved closer, gently touching his face. "So yes, you have my permission to win me back, to build something new, to discover together what love can be when it's based not on expectations, but on conscious choices." The sun finally set completely, and the first stars began to appear in the sky of New York City. There, under the starry sky of Central Park, Hannah and Richard sealed not a promise of a happy ending, but a commitment to build their own story, in their own time, in their own way. Because sometimes destiny takes us on winding paths just to show us that some stories need time to be rewritten, some loves need to mature to truly blossom, and some people need to get lost to finally find themselves. And as they walked back to the car, hand in hand under the starry sky, both knew that this wasn't a story of a happy ending. It was the beginning of a new journey, written with 4 hands with the ink of experience and the wisdom of time. Dear listeners, we hope that Hannah and Richard's story has touched your hearts. To continue this journey of emotions and discoveries, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories. Find it here by clicking on the left. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of love and life. Share with us in the comments, have you ever experienced a love story that needed time to blossom? Which city are you following us from? We'll be waiting for you in our next story.